August 23, 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The pipes hissed before we saw anything. A sharp metallic breath ran through the walls, followed by the steady rush of hot water flooding into the building. Somewhere above us, a radiator knocked twice-old metal expanding under pressure, then settled into a low, reassuring hum. Several women flinched. I did not. Not because I was calm, but because I did not yet understand what I was hearing. For days, maybe weeks, our transport had dissolved, time into expectation. Every mile carried the same certainty we were being taken to a prison camp. Concrete yards, barbed wire, shouting guards. The kind of place where you learned very quickly how little you mattered. That certainty had been built carefully over years. We had been told what America was, what it did to enemies. The words had been repeated until they felt like facts. So when the truck finally stopped, my body prepared itself before my mind could object. Shoulders stiff, jaw set, eyes forward. The doors opened. Warm air spilled inside. Not the stale warmth of overcrowded barracks, but something clean, carrying the faint scent of soap steam and boiled cloth. It was a smell I knew intimately, a hospital smell. We stepped down onto a floor so polished, it reflected the overhead lights like shallow water. Long white tubes buzzed softly above us, casting even illumination down a corridor that stretched farther than I could see. No guard towers, no dogs, no shouting. A cart rolled past its rubber wheels, whispering against linoleum. Glass bottles clinked gently inside a metal tray, clear liquid, amber liquid, each labeled in tidy English type. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed with a hydraulic sigh. Someone laughed, casually. That was the first shock. Not fear, normality. A woman stood near the entrance desk, sleeves rolled up, sensible shoes scuffed from long use. She held a clipboard under one arm, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She looked up, scanned our faces, not with hostility, not with curiosity, but with the practiced focus of someone already thinking 3 tasks ahead. "All right," she said. "Let's keep this moving. We're behind schedule. Behind schedule." As if we were late arrivals to a shift. Names were called, papers checked, forms stamped. When it was my turn, I stepped forward automatically. "Mayor Elizabeth," she read. "Occupation nurse," I said. She nodded once and flipped the page. "You'll be assigned to Ward C surgical recovery, 12-hour rotation." The words hovered between us, refusing to settle. "I am captured," I said carefully, as if clarity itself might correct the mistake. She looked up, genuinely puzzled. Then her expression softened, not apologetic, not stern. "Yes," she said. "And we're short on hands." That was the moment the ground shifted, not because of kindness, but because of purpose. This was not charity. This was necessity. By late 1944, America was fighting a war that spanned oceans. Millions of its men were overseas. Normandy, Italy, the Pacific, leaving hospitals strained beyond capacity. Women had stepped into factories, farms, offices, and wards without ceremony. Still, it was not enough. So America made a decision that would have been unthinkable where I came from. They looked at captured enemy nurses and saw unused skill. Not criminals, not symbols, resources. We were led deeper into the building. The rhythm of the place revealed itself in fragments, a wall clock ticking steadily, a coffee pot bubbling on a heating plate at the nurses' station, stacks of folded white sheets still warm from the laundry room, schedules pinned straight, corners aligned. Everything worked. Not dramatically, not cruelly, correctly. At the nurses' station, an older woman introduced herself as Margaret O'Connor. Her accent placed her somewhere Midwest. Her hands were roughened from work. Her movements economical. "You've done surgical recovery before?" she asked. "Yes," I answered. "Good," she said. "Then you know the rules already. Charts matter. Hands washed every time. If you're unsure, ask. No threat. No warning. Just expectation." As we entered Ward C, I saw the patients, young men, pale, wrapped in bandages that smelled of iodine and clean cotton. Some slept. Some stared at the ceiling. One winced as Margaret adjusted his dressing and murmured reassurance, like she had done it 1,000 times. No one glared at us. No one spat. No one reminded us we were enemies. At a porcelain sink reel porcelain uncracked, I scrubbed my hands under water that ran endlessly hot. Steam curled up around my wrists. I stared at my reflection in the small mirror above the sink. A German prisoner, standing in an American military hospital, about to care for American wounded. Back home, we had been taught that mercy was weakness. That control required fear. That enemies existed to be broken so they could never rise again. Here, control came from something else entirely. Abundance. America did not need to humiliate us. It had power industrial organizational human. It could afford clean floors, hot water paperwork and procedure. It could afford to follow rules even when dealing with enemies. That realization unsettled me more than brutality ever could have, because brutality would have confirmed everything we had been taught. This did not. As I took my place, beside the first bed clipboard in hand, Margaret glanced at me once more, not to watch, but to trust. "Let me know if you need anything," she said. "We're all running on fumes tonight." We. The word lingered. Somewhere down the hall, a bell rang softly. A patient called for help. I stepped forward, automatically muscle memory guiding my hands. The war did not end in that moment, but something else did. For the first time since my capture, the question that formed in my mind was not what will they do to me? It was this. If this is America, then everything we were warned about, it was wrong. And if that was true, then the war I thought I understood was already breaking apart. Right here under fluorescent lights, with soap on my hands, and a system strong enough to trust its enemy with a life. Fear didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived with silence, the kind that comes after the first shock fades when your mind finally has room to ask what your body has been too busy surviving to consider. On my second day in Ward C, I began to count everything. I counted the minutes between rounds. I counted the bottles on the supply cart. I counted the pills in the tray before I handed it to Margaret O'Connor, then counted again after she checked my work without looking annoyed. I counted because counting made the world feel controllable, and because I was waiting, not for kindness to continue, for it to stop. That was how I had been trained. Kindness was never offered without a reason. If it appeared, it was either Bader, the calm before punishment. The Reich had taught us that Americans were undisciplined, soft and cruel in unpredictable ways. Monsters in clean uniforms. People who smiled while planning humiliation. So when the hospital ran smoothly, when procedures were explained, when no one shouted, I could not accept it as real. My mind kept searching for the hidden hook beneath the velvet. It must be a test. I told myself that every time a doctor nodded at me instead of dismissing me, every time an American nurse offered a quiet, "You okay?" during the endless night shifts, every time a patient accepted my care without spitting a curse, they're watching. They're writing something down. They're waiting for the moment I slip. The fear sharpened my hands. In Germany, mistakes were not corrected. They were punished. You learned quickly that survival depended on anticipation. If you could predict what authority wanted, you could avoid being noticed. Being noticed was dangerous. Here notice came in a different form. Dr. Thomas Reedtall, lean a quiet man with tired eyes, stopped at the nurse's station one morning and asked casually, "How's Ward C holding up?" Margaret answered for both of us. "We're managing." Dr. Reed's gaze flicked to my chart notes. "Good handwriting," he said. My stomach tightened. Compliment or trap? I waited for the next sentence to reveal the blade. It didn't come. He simply moved on, checking vitals with a calm that felt almost insulting in its steadiness. I watched him walk away, trying to interpret the moment like a coded message. In my world, a compliment meant you were being measured. In this world, it might have meant exactly what it sounded like. That possibility frightened me more than any obvious cruelty, because obvious cruelty would have been familiar. This wasn't. The first real crack in my composure came with a patient named Private James Miller. He was 19, maybe 20, a steelworker before the war. Margaret told me that, in passing, as if such details were as normal as blood pressure readings. He had been injured during training, not combat, a vehicle accident, crushed ribs, a lung that refused to behave. When I approached his bed, with fresh gauze and antiseptic, he watched me with eyes too alert for someone in pain. His jaw tightened. "No," he said. I paused, unsure I'd heard correctly. "No," Margaret echoed from behind me. Miller's gaze never left my face. "I don't want her touching me." The words hit like a slap. The room didn't freeze exactly, but something in me did. Blood warmed my cheeks. My hands holding the tray felt suddenly clumsy. Margaret's voice stayed level. "She's a nurse, same as me. She's here to help." "She's German," Miller said louder now, as if naming my nationality was proof enough. "My cousin died in France." There it was. Not propaganda. Reality. This was the part I had been waiting for. The moment the mask slipped, the moment hatred took over, the moment America became what we had been told it was. My heartbeat hammered. I waited for guards. For shouting. For punishment. For me or for him. Instead, Margaret did something I did not expect. She pulled a chair to the side of his bed and sat down. Not towering over him. Not demanding. Just present. "I'm sorry about your cousin," she said simply. "Truly." Miller's eyes flickered. "But she isn't your cousin's enemy today," Margaret continued. "Today she's the person who's going to keep you breathing." Miller's lips pressed together. His breath rattled slightly. He looked away toward the window. Margaret leaned closer, her voice still low, still controlled. "You can say no. That's your right. But if you refuse care, Dr. Reed will come in and he'll make the decision for you. I'd rather you choose." Choose. That word didn't exist in the same way where I came from. Miller's fingers twitched against the sheet. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, then exhaled, sharp, resentful. "Fine," he muttered. "Just be quick." I stepped forward, careful, feeling the weight of his gaze like heat on my skin. I cleaned the wound with steady hands. I changed the dressing without flinching. I said nothing, because I did not trust my voice. When I finished, I stepped back. Miller didn't thank me. He didn't look at me either, but he didn't refuse again. That night, the fear returned stronger, not because of Miller's anger, because of Margaret's restraint. She had every reason to hate me. She had losses too, everyone did. Yet she had chosen procedure over emotion, professionalism over revenge. And she had done it in front of a patient who wanted permission to hate. She had refused to give it. I lay awake later, staring at the ceiling of the women's quarters, listening to the distant hum of generators and the occasional metallic knock of pipes. My mind replayed the scene over and over, searching for what I had missed. Margaret hadn't defended me because she liked me. She hadn't protected me because she was naive. She had protected the system, because the system mattered more than her feelings. That was a concept I struggled to hold. In Germany, the system demanded loyalty but offered no protection. It punished mistakes and rewarded fear. It trained people to obey, not to function. Here, the system seemed designed to keep functioning even when emotions ran hot. Everything was procedures charting sterilization inventory rounds. Not because Americans loved rules for their own sake, but because rules created predictability, and predictability prevented chaos. I began to see how different kinds of propaganda operated. Yes, America had its posters. It glimpsed them in newspapers, caricatures of enemy faces, slogans meant to harden resolve. Every nation at war does it. They had to. But propaganda here seemed aimed outward to rally people. In Germany, propaganda aimed inward to control people. That difference mattered. German discipline was enforced with fear of punishment. American discipline was enforced with trust and process. You didn't comply because you feared the guard. You complied because the system worked, and if it worked for you, you protected it. That was why Margaret could look at a hostile patient and keep her voice steady. That was why Dr. Reed could treat an enemy nurse like a colleague without making it personal. And that was why my fear had nowhere to land. Because the thing I had been trained to expect arbitrary cruelty wasn't efficient here. Efficiency was everything. America was building ships, planes, tanks, rifles, medicines, beds on schedules, so precise they felt like law. This hospital was a smaller version of the same machine, supplies arriving on time, staff rotating in shifts, files organized so nothing was lost. When you're that organized, cruelty is a disruption. It's noise. And noise gets people killed. The terrifying conclusion formed slowly like ice thickening on a river. America wasn't being kind to prove a point. America was being kind because it could afford to be and because it worked. Kindness here wasn't softness. It was management. It was a nation so confident in its strength that it didn't need to demonstrate it by breaking a prisoner. By the end of the week, the fear had changed shape. I no longer feared punishment. I feared understanding. Because once you see a system that holds itself together without terror once, you watch people choose restraint even when grief gives them every excuse not to. You begin to question the system that raised you. And if that system was built on fear, then fear is all it has. The next morning, as I walked into Ward C under the steady fluorescent lights, I found Private Miller awake. He watched me approach. His jaw tightened, then loosened. He didn't smile. But when I reached for his chart, he said quietly, barely audible, "How's it look?" It wasn't friendliness. It was something more unsettling. It was recognition. And I realized the trap I had been waiting for was an American kindness. It was the comparison taking root in my own mind when I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. Because the question had already formed, and it would not leave me alone. If America could run a war this vast and still keep its rules, what had we sacrificed ours for kindness, I learned is most disarming when it is ordinary. It did not announce itself. It did not ask to be recognized. It appeared in routine, small, repeatable acts that carried no drama and therefore no escape. You could not dismiss them as exceptions. You had to live with them. The first time an American soldier thanked me, I assumed it was the medication. He was propped on pillows, his breathing shallow but steady, the sharp edge of pain softened by morphine. I had finished changing his dressing and was halfway to the door when his fingers brushed my sleeve. "Thank you, Mom." The words landed awkwardly, like a misfiled form. I turned back unsure how to respond. Gratitude had never been part of the exchange where I came from. Care was expected. Endurance was required. Thanks were unnecessary. "You're welcome," I said. Finally, the phrase unfamiliar in my mouth. He nodded once and closed his eyes again, the moment already complete for him. For me, it lingered. That was how it went. No single gesture was overwhelming. But they accumulated, each one, eroding a little more of what I thought I understood. A doctor would ask my opinion, not rhetorically, not to test me, but because he wanted it. A nurse would correct my chart quietly, without embarrassment, then explain why. A patient would apologize for bleeding on clean sheets. No one ever introduced me as the German. They introduced me as the nurse on Ward C. The shift schedules didn't care where you were born. They cared whether you showed up. One afternoon, Dr. Thomas Reed stopped me near the nurse's station, a chart tucked under his arm. "Mayor," he said, "you've seen this patient longer than I have today." "What's your read?" I hesitated, Only a fraction of a second, but he noticed. Speak freely, he added. Not impatient, not indulgent. I need accuracy, not rank. That sentence stayed with me. Accuracy, not rank. In Germany, rank decided truth. Here, truth was expected to rise on its own if the system allowed it room. I answered him. He listened. Then he nodded and changed his plan slightly. No one commented. No one recorded the moment. But it mattered. The most unexpected kindness came during the night shifts. Night compressed everything. Fewer voices, dimmer lights. The machines seemed louder when the world grew quiet. Fatigue stripped pretense away. You learned who people were when no one was watching. It was during one of those nights that Margaret slid a metal mug toward me across the nurses' station. Coffee, she said. It's bad, but it's hot. I stared at it longer than necessary. Sharing coffee where I came from was an act of familiarity, something you did with people you trusted. It crossed lines. It implied equality. You don't have to, I said. She shrugged. You're still standing. That counts? She said it without ceremony and walked away, leaving the mug steaming under the soft light. I drank it slowly, the bitterness sharp and grounding. It tasted like endurance. Nothing followed. No conditions. No expectations. I began to realize that no one here was keeping score the way I had learned to. In the weeks that followed, I saw how American professionalism was shaped by history. These men and women, Margaret among them, had grown up during the Great Depression. They knew scarcity. They knew lines and ration cards and the quiet shame of asking for help. When the war came, it did not introduce hardship to them, it reorganized it. They had learned early that dignity came from doing your part, not from demanding recognition. That work done correctly was its own justification. In the hospital, that ethic was everywhere. Supplies were used carefully, but without panic. Equipment was repaired before it was replaced. Time was respected. No one lingered in complaint. When frustration surfaced, it was directed toward solving problems, not assigning blame. This was not idealism. It was practicality. The hospital itself reflected that mindset. It was not beautiful. Paint peeled in places. Corners bore the scars of gurneys turned too sharply. But everything functioned. Drawers labeled. Charts filed. Procedures followed. No one talked about morality. They practiced it. One evening, as we prepared a patient for transport, I heard swing music drifting softly from a radio someone had brought in. The sound was barely audible, but it carried a sense of ease, an unspoken reminder that life continued beyond this ward. Margaret noticed me listening. My dad used to play, that she said, after supper, before the bank closed. I asked her once carefully why she treated us the way she did. She considered the question longer than I expected. Because the rules say I should, she answered finally. And because the rules are right. That was it. No appeal to virtue. No explanation of character. Just rules. That answer explained more than any speech ever could. Rules here were not instruments of fear. They were agreements, contracts between the individual and the system. Follow them, and the system would hold. That included us. The last piece of my resistance fell with Private James Miller. Weeks after his refusal, I found him awake as I approached his bed. He watched me quietly. His hostility dulled into something else. Fatigue, perhaps. How's it look, he asked. I told him the truth. His lungs were improving. He would need time. He nodded, absorbing the information like a man used to hard facts. You from Germany? He asked after a moment. Yes. He exhaled slowly. My cousin was too. I waited, uncertain. He didn't come back, Miller said. Not accusing, just stating. I'm sorry, I said. He studied my face, then looked away. Guess you didn't either, he muttered. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't hatred anymore. And that was enough. For American viewers, this is the part that feels familiar. The America of your grandparents, The one that didn't need constant affirmation. The one that believed in work, in order and fairness as something you practiced, not declared. A country that ran on trust in systems more than trust in personalities. Watching it from the outside, I saw its strength more clearly than those born inside it. This was a nation capable of disagreement without disintegration, of discipline without cruelty, of unity without uniformity. It treated me not as an enemy to be crushed, but as a professional to be held to a standard. And once that standard was offered, it did not matter where I came from. That realization was both comforting and dangerous, because once you understand that respect can be procedural, that dignity can be enforced quietly through systems that work, you begin to ask why any nation would choose fear instead. I didn't know then where that question would lead me. I only knew that kindness repeated daily, and without performance, had done what violence never could. It had made me see the world as it might be if people trusted systems enough to follow them and trusted one another enough to be held accountable by them. And standing there under fluorescent lights that never flickered, with coffee cooling beside me and charts stacked neatly, in order, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not relief, belonging. Not to a country, but to a standard. And once you have lived inside that standard, even briefly, it changes the way you measure everything else that follows. The breaking point arrived without warning. Not during an argument. Not during a crisis anyone could point to afterward. It came on a quiet night, the kind that lulled you into believing nothing else could happen. The ward lights were dimmed, shaded to spare exhausted eyes. Machines ticked softly, each sound precise and predictable. Outside, winter pressed against the windows, the glass cold enough to steal warmth from the air. I was checking vitals when the young soldier's breathing changed. It was subtle at first, an uneven hitch, a pause that lasted half a second too long. Then another. His chest rose, shallowly struggled, fell again. I stepped closer. His eyes opened unfocused, sweat beaded along his hairline. His fingers clawed weakly at the sheet. "Mom," he whispered. The word struck like a physical blow. "Mom, don't let them." His voice cracked. Panic broke through the medications haze. He turned his head side to side, searching for someone who wasn't there. "Mom, I don't want to die here." I froze. I had heard that voice before. Not his words, but that sound beneath them. The naked terror stripped of uniforms and slogans and bravery. I had heard it years earlier, in a different hospital, under blackout curtains and flickering bulbs. My brother Carl had sounded the same. He was 19 when he left, too young to shave without cutting himself. He tried to hide his fear with jokes that never quite worked. My mother pretended not to notice. When the telegram came, it was short, impersonal, efficient, killed in action, Italy. No body, no grave, no place to put the grief except inside yourself. And now, in an American hospital, an American boy called for his mother with that same voice. Something inside me tore loose. My hands began to shake. I steadied them against the bed rail, forcing myself to finish the check. Oxygen, pulse, temperature, everything done correctly, because that was what professionalism demanded. But inside the walls were collapsing. "It's all right," I said softly, though I didn't know who I was trying to convince. "You're safe." He didn't hear me. "Mom," he sobbed, "please." I finished what I could and stepped out of the room before my composure betrayed me. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded far too final. I made it to the supply room before my legs gave out. I slid down the wall and sat on the cold tile floor, my back pressed hard against it as if it could hold me together. My breath came in short, useless gasps. I pressed my fist to my mouth to keep from making a sound. I did not cry loudly. I had learned long ago that crying drew attention, but tears came anyway, hot, relentless, blurring the neatly stacked bandages on the shelves in front of me. My shoulders shook. My chest ached, as if something long contained had finally ruptured. I had told myself hatred made me strong. That discipline kept me intact. That distance protected me. But hatred is heavy, and I was exhausted from carrying it. The door opened. I didn't look up. I expected reprimand, questions, orders to return to my post. Instead, someone sat down beside me. Not close enough to touch. Not far enough to ignore. Margaret. She said nothing. She didn't ask what was wrong. Didn't tell me to calm down. Didn't offer words meant to smooth things over. She simply sat her presence steady, sharing the same cold floor. Time passed without shape. When I finally spoke, the words came without translation, without preparation. I was taught to hate you. The sentence sounded small in the room. Insufficient. Like an apology offered too late. Margaret nodded once. I figured she said quietly, "They told us you were cruel." I continued, "That you enjoyed breaking prisoners. That kindness was just another weapon." My voice faltered. They told us hatred was duty. She was silent for a moment longer than before. Then she spoke. "My cousin died at Normandy," she said. 19. We buried an empty coffin. I looked at her for the first time. "My neighbor's boy froze to death in the Ardennes," she added. "They sent back his dog tags." Her voice didn't shake. She didn't dramatize it. These were facts she had already learned how to carry. "We've lost people too," she said. "We just decided it wouldn't turn us into something worse." That was when I broke completely. Because she was right. Both sides had lost sons, brothers, futures, families rearranged around absence. Mothers on both continents unfolded telegrams with the same trembling hands. But only one side standing here in a quiet hospital corridor had chosen not to let that loss harden into revenge. America had every reason to be cruel. News from Europe arrived daily. Photographs, reports, lists of the dead. The men lying in these beds had friends who would never come home because of uniforms like mine. And yet the system held. No collective punishment. No quiet humiliations disguised as policy. No indulgence in cruelty simply because it was available. Instead, there were rules. Rules that applied even when grief made them inconvenient. That choice, to absorb loss without passing it on, was not weakness. It was restraint. And restraint, I realized then, required a kind of strength I had never been taught to recognize. I thought of my mother sitting alone at the kitchen table after Carl's death hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. I thought of American mothers doing the same. Grief was not national. What made the difference was what you did with it. Margaret stood and offered her hand, not to pull me up, but to steady me. "Come on," she said. "We've still got work. Work. Not vengeance. Not ideology. Work." We returned to the ward together. The young soldier slept now, his breathing eased. I checked his vitals again, my hand steady, not because the pain was gone, but because something else had taken its place. Clarity. I could no longer hate them, not honestly, not after hearing their losses spoken without bitterness, not after watching them choose restraint when cruelty would have been easy and even understandable. Hatred requires distance, and here there was none. Standing at the foot of that bed, knowing his mother might never see him again, I understood something no training manual or poster could teach. The greatness of this country did not lie in its weapons or its factories, vast as they were. It lay in its refusal to surrender its humanity even when the world offered every excuse to do so. That night, as I finished my shift, exhaustion settled into my bones like lead. But beneath it was a quiet resolve. The war had taken my brother. It had taken their sons. But here under dim lights and ticking machines, America had decided that loss would not become cruelty. And for the first time since my capture, I realized I was no longer standing between enemies. I was standing among people who had chosen not to become what the war tried to make them. and that understanding changed me in a way no prison ever could. Understanding did not arrive like forgiveness. It arrived like arithmetic. After the night I broke in the supply room, I began to notice patterns I could no longer ignore. Not moments of kindness, those I had learned to recognize, but the machinery that made kindness repeatable, reliable, boring even. America's mercy was not an emotion. It was a consequence. I saw it in the supplies first. Bandages never disappeared in a panic. When a shelf ran low, another cart arrived. When a bottle emptied, a replacement was logged before anyone raised their voice. The pharmacy ledger was updated at the end of every shift, initials neat lines straight. Nothing dramatic, nothing improvised in crisis. Abundance, I realized, was not just about having more. It was about not needing to choose who deserved less. In Germany, scarcity had taught us cruelty. When resources shrink, every decision feels like theft. Someone must lose so someone else can survive. Fear becomes efficient. Suspicion becomes policy. Here, abundance made a different ethic possible. America could afford procedures. It could afford patience. It could afford to treat enemies according to rules written long before the war began, and to follow them even when no one was watching. I began to understand that the hospital was not an exception. It was a reflection. Beyond its walls, the country was doing the same thing at scale. Factories ran 3 shifts without collapsing. Farms produced more food than the population could consume. Trains crossed the continent on schedules so precise they felt inevitable. The war was not being held together by speeches. It was being held together by logistics. One afternoon, during a rare break, I stood near a window and watched trucks roll past the hospital grounds, crates stacked with mathematical care. Drivers waved to one another as they passed, confident that the system would catch them if something went wrong. This was power expressed as capacity. Capacity creates options, and options allow restraint. The Geneva Convention was never spoken aloud in Ward C, but it lived everywhere. In the way we were housed, in the way labor was assigned, in the way complaints rare, but not forbidden, were documented and addressed. Rules mattered here, not because breaking them invited terror, but because following them preserved legitimacy. That distinction mattered more than I had ever been taught. In Germany, authority demanded obedience, but offered no protection. Rules bent around power. Exceptions were rewards. Punishments were unpredictable. People complied because they were afraid. In America, authority seemed almost constrained, bound by its own procedures. Power did not float above the system. It was embedded in it. Doctors answered questions. Nurses corrected one another without humiliation. Mistakes were investigated, not avenged. This was confidence institutionalized. Only a system sure of its strength can afford to bind itself. I felt this most sharply during an incident that would have ended very differently where I came from. A medication error minor caught early. The dosage had been logged incorrectly, not administered. No harm done. In Germany, that would have been the end of someone's career. Or worse. Here, Dr. Reed called a brief meeting. He reviewed the steps, asked questions, adjusted a procedure. No names were raised in accusation. No punishment assigned. We fixed the process, he said simply, so it doesn't happen again. That was it. The system absorbed the failure instead of sacrificing a person. I walked back to the ward afterward with a strange tightness in my chest. This was the difference. America did not rely on fear to enforce discipline. It relied on predictability, on trust that the rules would be applied evenly tomorrow as they were today. That trust was why Margaret could sit calmly beside a hostile patient and defend procedure over anger. It was why Dr. Reed could treat an enemy nurse as a colleague without needing to make a show of dominance. Cruelty would have been inefficient. And inefficiency, I learned, was America's real enemy. The war would not be won by rage. It would be won by output curves, shipping schedules, training pipelines that replaced losses faster than enemies could inflict them. The battlefield was as much a ledger as it was a map. Once you understand that cruelty stops making sense, I began to realize that what I had mistaken for softness was actually surplus strength. America did not need to prove itself through humiliation. It was already proving itself every hour in steel, in grain, in electricity, in systems that held under pressure. That was why kindness here felt so unremarkable. It did not require courage. It required confidence. Late one evening, after another long shift, I stood alone in the corridor, listening to the familiar sounds, the hum of power through the walls, the steady ticking of a wall clock, the distant footsteps of a nurse on rounds. Everything worked. That thought returned again and again. Because when things work, morality becomes sustainable. You can afford to be humane when your systems do not fail under strain. You can obey international law when your power does not depend on shortcuts. You can treat enemies as humans when your victory does not hinge on breaking them. This was not accidental virtue. It was engineered. For American viewers, I know this is where the comparison becomes uncomfortable. Because the America I witnessed was not perfect, but it was coherent. It knew what it was building and how to maintain it. Differences existed, but they did not paralyze function. Disagreement did not dissolve shared purpose. The hospital did not care who you voted for. It cared whether you washed your hands correctly, whether you logged the dosage, whether you showed up. Function came first. That focus in doing the work right was the quiet genius of the country at war. And standing inside it, as someone raised under a system that demanded fear instead of function, I understood the most unsettling lesson of my life. Ethics are not fragile. They are expensive. Only the strong can afford them. What frightened me was not that America possessed this strength. It was the thought of what would happen if it ever lost it. What happens when abundance narrows, when systems weaken, when trust erodes and cruelty begins to look efficient again? I did not know the answers then. I only knew what I had seen. A nation at the height of its power, choosing restraint. A society unified enough to bind itself to rules and follow them even when it hurt. That choice, repeated thousands of times a day in hospitals, factories, farms, was what truly set America apart. Not perfection, but confidence. And once you recognize that confidence, the kind that sustains morality, rather than performing it, you cannot mistake cruelty for strength again. As I returned to my duties, clipboard in hand, I realized the war had already taught me something no victory parade ever could. Power does not have to crush. It can sustain. And that I understood was America's greatest advantage, owned far more decisive than any weapon. I did not leave America in a moment that looked like history. There was no band, no photographers, no speech to declare what had been accomplished. My name appeared on a list. A week later, I was on a train heading east. Then another. Then a ship crossing the Atlantic with the same steady certainty that seemed to power everything in that country. The shoreline faded into fog. I stood at the rail and tried to inventory what I was carrying home. I had no souvenirs, no medals, no photographs of the ward. Nothing I could place on a table and say, this is what happened. What I carried instead was heavier and harder to show. A standard. Germany greeted me with a silence that felt damaged. Not the calm silence of order, but the hollow quiet of collapse, the kind that lingers after the machinery of a society has been blown apart. Cities were ribs of brick and twisted iron. Streets were ash-stained, littered with glass that caught the light like ice. Children played in ruins because there were no playgrounds left. Adults moved with the dull focus of people who had learned not to hope too loudly. Hospitals were worse. We worked in buildings, missing half their windows. The cold came in like a second patient. We boiled instruments too many times. We tore sheets into bandages. Soap was rationed, sometimes absent entirely. Painkillers were counted and recounted until the numbers made you feel sick. The war was over, they said. But it continued, here in shortage and illness, in the quiet violence of desperation. I returned to nursing because it was the only part of myself I still trusted. It was the only skill that had not been corrupted by slogans. In the beginning, I tried to work the way we always had. Quiet, efficient, hard, but I could not. Because I had seen something else. I had seen a hospital where procedures protected people instead of punishing them. Where mistakes were used to fix systems instead of destroy careers. Where patients said, "Thank you," as naturally as breathing. Where respect could be routine. So I began to change almost without deciding to. I insisted on charting even when paper was scarce. It's not a slogan. A standard, and once you have seen that standard, once it has lived in your hands and your habits, you cannot unsee it. You can only decide whether to pass it on. There was no parade for what happened in that hospital. No flags waved when a German nurse washed her hands beside an American one. No photographer stood ready when a wounded soldier accepted care from someone he had been taught to fear. No headline recorded the moment a system chose restraint over revenge and moved on without comment. History does not linger there. History prefers victories that can be measured. Territory gained enemies, defeated factories, counted ships launched. It remembers dates and signatures and photographs of leaders shaking hands beneath bright lights. It does not remember hot water running through pipes at midnight. It does not record clipboards filled out correctly. It does not pause for coffee shared during a night shift. But families do. Families remember the grandfather who came home alive when no one expected him to. The grandmother who spoke quietly of America, not with bitterness, but with something like respect. The father who never explained the war in detail, only said, "It wasn't how we were told it would be." Those memories do not march. They persist. Looking back now, what strikes me most is not how extraordinary America was, but how unremarkable its goodness felt to those living inside it. No one in that hospital believed they were shaping the moral legacy of a nation. They were following procedures, covering shifts, doing work that needed doing. They did not wake up each morning intending to be virtuous. They woke up intending to be correct. And correctness repeated thousands of times a day became character. That is how standards are built, not through declarations, but through habits. Through systems that hold when emotions run hot. Through people who believe rules matter most when they are inconvenient. The Americans who treated us humanely never imagined their restraint would echo across decades and oceans. They could not know that long after the war ended, their quiet professionalism would be carried home by former enemies and passed down as something worth remembering. They simply believed that strength did not excuse the abandonment of principle. That belief unspoken, uncelebrated, was the real inheritance of that war. And now it belongs to you, to the descendants of those who fought, to the families of those who were captured, to anyone who wonders what power is meant to look like when it is tested. Because the question history never asks, but time always does, is not who won. It is what kind of people victory allowed you to be. America in that moment did not need cruelty to assert itself. It had abundance. It had unity. It had systems strong enough to absorb grief without turning it outward. And because of that, it could afford restraint. Morality, I learned, is not something you proclaim. It is something you can sustain. Sustainability is what makes virtue rare. Years later, I would hear Americans speak with longing about that era, about grandparents who worked without complaint, about communities that trusted institutions, about a country that seemed less divided, less suspicious of itself. From the outside, I understood that longing, because I had seen that Americanaut as myth, but as machinery. The way order created space for decency. The way unity made generosity possible. The way confidence allowed rules to bind power instead of serving it. I had also seen how fragile those conditions were. When abundance narrows, fear returns. When systems weaken, shortcuts tempt. When unity fractures, cruelty begins to look efficient again. That is when standards matter most, not the standards written. I insisted on charting even when paper was scarce. If we don't write it down, I told my colleagues, we forget it. And forgotten care becomes careless care. I explained procedures to younger nurses instead of barking orders. I corrected errors quietly, without humiliation, because I had learned humiliation was inefficient. Some older nurses looked at me as if I had become naive. Others watched closely, then began doing the same. A doctor once snapped at an aide in frustration, and I heard my own voice, calm, foreign, even to me, say, "We can fix the problem without breaking the person." The room went still. Then the doctor exhaled, nodded once, and walked away. That was how legacy began. Not with speeches, with habits. Years passed, and Germany rebuilt itself, slowly, unevenly. Concrete replaced rubble. Glass returned to windows. Trains began running again late, at first, then on schedule. New nurses arrived, who had never known the war, only its aftermath. And always the question returned. What was America like, they asked. They expected stories of cruelty, of arrogance, of humiliation. I told them about hot water. They laughed, confused. So I told them what hot water meant. Not comfort, reliability. The quiet certainty that systems worked. That care could be planned instead of improvised in panic. I told them about shift schedules pinned straight, about coffee shared during night duty, about doctors who asked questions instead of demanding obedience. At first, people didn't believe me. Propaganda digs deep grooves. Truth has to wear them smooth over time. But I wasn't the only one who came back carrying those strange, quiet memories. Men returned from American farms and factories. Former POWs who had worked in fields under open skies, who had been paid in camp script, who had been allowed to buy soap and chocolate and paper to write home. They spoke of similar things. Not perfection, not friendliness from everyone, but rules, predictability, a kind of decency enforced not by sentiment, but by system. We became, without planning, to a bridge. Not diplomats, not politicians, witnesses. Some of us wrote memoirs. Many did not. We had learned to be silent in Germany. But even the quiet ones carried the legacy into their homes. They raised children who asked fewer questions about hate and more about how such a war could happen. And in a strange way, America lived on in those questions. Decades later, letters began to arrive, sometimes in careful German, sometimes in hesitant English. My grandfather was a POW in the United States, one would say. He never talked about battles. He talked about kindness. A woman from Ohio once wrote that her grandmother had been a nurse at a military hospital in Wisconsin. She said she worked with a German nurse the letter read. She wondered if it was you. I held that paper in my hands for a long time, stunned by the thought that the story had traveled both directions across the ocean and survived the years intact. Because that was the real legacy. Not that America had treated prisoners well as a political strategy, though perhaps it was. The legacy was that the kindness was memorable because it was procedural, repeatable, real. It did not depend on one perfect person. It depended on a system that made decency the default. For the descendants of German prisoners, I understand the gratitude you carry. Many of you grew up with a strange family, truth your grandfather survived not only because he was fed, but because someone decided he would not be degraded. You owe your existence in part to restraint. And for Americans, I hope this story does something else. I hope it reminds you of the America that once existed at its most confident, an America that didn't need cruelty to feel strong. An America that could afford to obey rules even in war. An America whose greatness was not announced, but practiced. History remembers who won, but families remember who was kind. That is what I brought home from America. Not a flag. He fractures cruelty begins to look efficient again. That is when standards matter most, not the standards written into textbooks or carved into monuments, but the ones carried quietly by people who remember what restraint once achieved. The hospital I worked in did not function because everyone agreed. It functioned because they agreed on process, on fairness, on the belief that dignity should not be negotiable, even for enemies. That belief is always available, but it must be chosen. So I leave you with the question that every generation eventually inherits, whether it wants to or not. If war came again today, if fear returned and anger demanded shortcuts, would you still choose to be that America, not the America of slogans or nostalgia, but the America of systems that work, of rules followed even when no one is watching, of enemies treated as human because strength allows it? History will remember who wins the next war. But families, German and American alike, will remember who was kind, and that memory, fragile as it may be, is still waiting to be chosen again.